Hey guys, today we're looking at the 9850X3D versus the 9800X3D in Escape from Tarkov 1.01 here in 2026. In this comparison, we'll see how big the gap really is, whether upgrading from a 9800X3D makes sense, and which one is the better pick if you're building new. Quick side note, I am aiming to reach 25,000 subs in the next 6 months, so if these Tarkov comparisons help you out, please consider subscribing and I'd really appreciate the support. Let's get into it. Before we jump into the results, here's a quick rundown on the test setup. Both CPUs were tested on the exact same configuration. I'm using an ASRock X870E Nova motherboard, 64 gigs of DDR5, and an Aorus Gen 5 10K for storage. For graphics, I'm using a Zotac Solid 5090 just to make sure I'm not GPU limited at all here. On the 9850X3D, I'm running a -30 undervolt with a +150 boost clock override. In game though, I don't really see it boost much past 5.6. But that's the setting I used. Looks like I didn't exactly win the silicon lottery with the sample. The F clock tops out at 2133 for this chip. Memory is running at 6000 CL30 with the U clock and M clock at 1:1. On the 9800X3D, I'm running a -40 undervolt with the +200 boost clock override. This one does a little better on the F clock. It's running at 2200 and the same 6000 CL30 memory with 1:1 on the U clock and M clock. On both systems, SMT is disabled, resizable bar is enabled. If you want to see my full tuning approach, I've got a 9800X3D tuning guide linked in the upper right hand and down in the description below. For in-game settings, I'm using my Pure 70 settings. That's my high texture optimized preset. To really stress the CPUs for this comparison, I focused on the most demanding sections of the most demanding map in the game, which is Streets of Tarkov. I ran my usual route down Klimov Street into Lexos, first in offline to get baseline numbers, and then online in real raids to see real world numbers. Each test was repeated 3 times. Just keep in mind the FPS numbers here are going to look a little lower than what you'd normally see in an average raid, and that's normal. I'm not trying to show the best case averages. This route is specifically chosen to hammer the CPU so that we can really make a comparison here. In a typical raid, your overall average FPS is probably going to be higher than this. Starting at 1080 offline on streets, the 9850X3D averages 138 FPS with 102 on the 1% lows and 94 on the 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D comes in at 132, 98, and 90 respectively. That puts the 9850X3D ahead by roughly 4 to 4.5% across the board. Not a massive gap, but this is kind of what I was expecting to see given the spec differences. Moving up to 1440 offline, things barely change, which tells us we're still very CPU limited. The 9850X3D averages 136 FPS average, 102 for 1% lows, and 94 for the 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D averaged 130, 97, and 90 respectively. Percentage-wise, the gap actually opens up slightly on the 1% lows at just over 5%, but it's still pretty close to what we saw in 1080. Moving on to 4K offline, we're still CPU bound here, so the numbers were very similar. 9850X3D averaged 135 FPS, 101 for 1% lows, and 93 for 0.1% lows. For the 9800X3D, it came in at a 130 average, 96 for 1%, and 88 for 0.1%. So even in 4K, you can see that we're really CPU bound. Now, jumping into online raids at 1080, the 9850X3D averaged 129 with 99 on the 1% lows and 92 on the 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D had a 123 average, 95 on the 1% and 86 on the 0.1% lows. So the gaps are similar to what we saw offline, but something I noticed here is that the 0.1% lows were up around 7% for the 9850. Moving on to 1440 online, the trend stayed consistent. The 9850X3D averaged 128 FPS with 97 on the 1% lows and 90 on the 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D came in at 121, 93, and 84 respectively. About a 6% uplift in averages, but again, the 0.1% lows are over 7% better on the 9850. Finally, in 4K online, the 9850X3D averaged 126 FPS with 97 on the 1% lows and 89 on the 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D sits at 119, 93, and 82 respectively. Here the average FPS gap is just under 6%, but the 0.1% lows jumped to about 8.5%, the largest gap I saw in all of my testing. So looking back on the numbers overall, a couple things really stood out to me. First, the delta between offline and online performance is smaller than I've ever seen. I've been doing these Tarkov CPU comparisons for a few years now, and normally when I run offline no AI as a baseline, there's a pretty noticeable drop once you go online. In this case, the gap is way tighter than usual, so I'm not exactly sure what changed, but it definitely feels like something under the hood is different in how the game is handling CPU load now. The other thing that caught my eye is that the gap in the 0.1% lows actually gets larger online compared to offline. Usually it goes the opposite way. Maybe the extra clock speed on the 9850X3D helps a bit with stability when the game's under heavier load. I'm not exactly sure why this was the case, but it was consistent enough across all the tests that it was worth pointing out to me. Either way, it lines up with what you actually feel in game. I'll say between these two powerhouse CPUs, performance is top notch on both. There's no bad experience here. That being said, in online raids, even though the gap isn't huge, there was just enough of a difference in smoothness for me to actually notice it while playing, and we saw that in the 0.1% lows. It's not a night and day difference, but it is there, and in a game like Tarkov where you're fighting for every single frame, it's something worth talking about. So we've seen there's a small but noticeable difference in smoothness, but what does that cost in terms of power and temps? For power draw, the 9850X3D is pulling about 24% more at 82 watts versus 66 on the 9800X3D. The temps are still low overall, but the 9850X3D runs about 13% hotter at 60 degrees versus 53 degrees Celsius. In exchange for all that extra power and heat, you're getting roughly 3.2% higher clocks at 5596 versus 5425. So yeah, there's a trade-off here. Slightly smoother performance, but with noticeably higher power and temps for a modest clock bump. So given all this, is it worth upgrading? If you already own a 9800X3D, I'd say don't bother. It's not a mandatory upgrade for Tarkov. The 9850X3D is basically a factory overclocked 9800X3D. So yeah, it does perform a bit better, but whether that's worth it really depends on how much you care about squeezing that tiny bit of extra consistency. If you really wanted that small boost, you could potentially sell your 9800X3D and pick up a 9850 for maybe 50 to 100 bucks all told. But for most people, it's just really not necessary. For new builds, it comes down to whether you want the absolute best or the best value. MSRP wise, the 9800X3D is $479 while the 9850 is $499. I've seen the 9800 drop as low as $449 and even lower in some deals. In terms of performance, I mean, it's almost a wash, so the 9800X3D is definitely the better value. That said, if you're a serious Tarkov player, that tiny extra edge and smoothness from the 9850X3D could be worth it, especially given the relatively small price difference and with PC component prices being what they are right now. Alright guys, that's all I've got for this one. If this video helped, consider dropping a like and subscribing. I post a lot of Tarkov CPU comparisons and optimization content like this. I'm aiming to reach 25,000 subs over the next 6 months, so I've got some work to do here and every bit of support helps. If you have any more questions about optimization or troubleshooting, feel free to join my Discord or even shoot me a message there. My username is Puri and I'm always happy to chat. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.